Hello everyone and good afternoon. I warmly welcome you to our event on the far right in the Trump era here at the Karl-Renner-Institut. My name is Sebastian Schublach and it's my privilege to host today's discussion. Most of you will know him or his work already, but nevertheless it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Cas Mudde. Cas Mudde is the Stanley Wade Shelton Professor of International Affairs, as well as Distinguished Research Professor at the University of Georgia. He's widely recognized and known as one of the leading scholars on populism, the far right, and political extremism today. His extensive research and numerous publications over the last 3 or so decades, including books such as Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, the Far Right in America, or this one, the Far Right Today, have profoundly shaped our understanding of contemporary radical right politics, both inside and outside academia. Cas Mudde also contributes frequently to public discourse, writing for prominent media outlets such as The Guardian, and he is offering critical insights into the challenges that radical right-wing movements and parties pose to liberal democracies worldwide. He's currently, and this is also the reason why he is right now in Austria, visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, the IWM, das Institut für die Wissenschaften vom Menschen, here in Vienna. We are delighted and honored to have him here this evening to discuss the rise and also the role of the far right in the Trump era and its implications for Europe. Small organizational remarks. We will start with a short speech, or with an introductory speech, which will be followed by a talk and, of course, questions for you if you have any, and I'm quite sure that you will have questions. So, without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Cas Mudde.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thanks everyone for coming. This was literally the topic given to me. And so I stuck with it. I actually don't talk too much about US politics, not so much because I'm afraid, but more because it is very hard to make sense of what is happening. You're kind of on a roller coaster, but it isn't on a clear track. So you don't really know where it's going, and every single time it goes somewhere, and people then think, okay, so if it goes straight, it will end up here. But then it takes a turn. And having lived through Trump 1.0, and having done all of these intellectual exercises of like every day trying to figure out, okay, so if it now continues to go straight, where does it end up? And then finding that it actually took a turn, it was exhausting, right? And so, for purely mental health reasons, I followed the news modestly. And my policy today is, if Trump says something, I ignore it. If he says it again a week later, I will start to note it. If other people start to talk about it who have any relevance, and there are not too many people who do in the Trump administration, then I will start thinking what that could mean. And it is very important to keep that in mind, particularly for those people who are very online. Like, the online community is not helping you. First of all, it responds to everything. And second of all, there's a kind of an economy of attention. And you get attention by having the most dramatic position. And so fascism isn't enough anymore. If you do not believe that we're going into civil war, you're not being heard. Now, I'm not saying that fascism or civil war are possible scenarios. Because today, in the US, you really cannot exclude anything. But they are among a whole range of scenarios. And in my opinion, not the most likely. Now, what am I going to do? I'm first going to argue that we're in the fourth phase of the post-war far right. That is the context that is important to understand what the far right today is and where it is different from what it used to be. And I feel that a lot of our debate still treats the far right a little bit as if we were in the 1980s, 90s. I'm going to talk about the return of Trump and explain why it was actually not inevitable. And particularly push back against narratives that have Trump as a kind of a Superman, with a cult of personality where people just devotedly follow him as they did Hitler, which incidentally, similar story. Hitler was also not a Superman. A lot of people just followed him because the alternatives were worse. Then I will speak about the new organization and to a certain extent mobilization. And yes, I will address social media too, but mostly because I will get a question about social media. I will also discuss Elon Musk for roughly the same reason. I will disappoint many of you by arguing that neither social media nor Musk are as important as everyone says they are. Then we come to the most depressing part. Yes, it gets worse, and that is counter strategies. And then finally, lessons for Europe, which there are. In part, one of the lessons is that Europe is not the US, or vice versa. Notes on terminology, I don't want to go there too much, but I use the right as anti-egalitarian. I focus on the far right, which is both the extreme right and the radical right. The extreme right is fundamentally anti-democratic. That means that they do not believe in popular sovereignty and majority rule. So they do not think that people should elect their own leaders. Think about historical fascism, National Socialism. There are very few openly extreme right actors today. Most are radical right, which means that they do believe that people should elect their own leaders, but they do not believe in minority rights, rule of law, independence of judiciary, media, things like that. What we call liberal democracy. The problem, though, is while this distinction theoretically is very clear, in practice, we have more and more actors who have both. Mostly actors that talk as if they accept democracy, but have problems with liberal democracy, but act in a way that undermines even democracy. Think about Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is actively undermining not just liberal democracy, but also particularly think about Trump, his support for January 6th, the uprising, his denial of the election results of 2020, which were actually the best organized elections probably in US history. And so as a consequence, increasingly scholars now use the term far right not to indicate the group of both extreme right and radical right actors, but actually certain actors which have both radical and extreme factions in them. Now, there is in the literature a distinction between different waves of post-war far right that comes from a German scholar called Klaus von Beime. He said that in 1945 to 55 there was the first wave of neo-fascism, mostly remnants of the past. A second wave of right-wing populism, 1955, roughly 1980, which was a combination of old fascism and kind of post-war phenomenon. It had a lot of people who were active in fascist groups of the 30s, 40s, but it also had people who weren't involved in that. It had issues like amnesty for collaborators, but it also had issues as immigration, post-war issues. So it was a kind of a transitional phase. And then the far right became more successful in the third wave, particularly electorally. That started in the 1980s and was particularly focused on the immigration issue. This is the easiest country to talk about it because actually the FPÖ was the most successful of all of them in Western Europe. In the third phase, the far right were seen as new and as outsiders, which even in the case of Austria was already problematic. Like, obviously, the FPÖ wasn't new, and they were also not outsiders. Not by the time that they actually became far right under Jörg Haider. They were part of the system, even though they were not as entrenched as ÖVP or SPÖ. They were also seen as electorally and politically marginal, and that was the case in most of Western Europe. Like, so in most of Western Europe, during the third phase, far-right parties were single-digit parties and were confronted with a cordon sanitaire, but meant that no one wanted to govern with them. There was one exception in Western Europe, which was the first Berlusconi government, which included the Lega Nord. Now, I've argued in my book, The Far Right Today, that today we're in the fourth phase that started roughly 2000, I think 9/11, and the interpretations of it were important. During the fourth phase, the far right has become part of the mainstream, which means that its issues have become broadly accepted as relevant, its discourse has become adopted, and they themselves have not only become electorally successful. According to a recent study, they are now the strongest party family as group of parties across Europe. But they've also become normalized as political actors. In a majority of EU member states, the far right has or does govern at the national or subnational level. At least centrist and right-wing parties in most countries now consider the far right as a normal potential coalition partner. But in certain countries, even left-wing parties will send a delegation to a far-right party congress. At the same time, it is very important to remember that the far right is very heterogeneous. There are huge differences in their electoral success, ranging from Fidesz at 50%, which of course free and unfair elections, but even if they would be free and fair, they would be in the 30–40%, at least 10 years ago, to parties in Iceland and Ireland that are 0 point something. There are parties that exist for 3–4 years, there are parties that exist for 70. There are parties that are represented in structurally, organizationally throughout whole countries, parties that have one member, the Party for Freedom. There are parties that are in their third or fourth government, parties that have never governed. So talking about the far right as if it is one bloc that all act the same and govern in the same way, have the same type of support, is not always helpful. Obviously, the electorate of a party that gets 40% is very different from the electorate of a party that gets 2%. Like, the electorate of Fidesz is roughly the Hungarian population. But the electorate of, in terms of like gender, age, education, those kind of things, it won't stand out that much because it's 50% of the population, right, that votes. But a party that gets 5% probably has some specifics. On average, but this is declining, right, your average voter is, which is interesting, never mentioned in Europe, white. Europeans get very nervous when you talk about categories of white or race. And that's all fine, but they're still white. They're male. Still roughly around 2/3 of the electorate is men, 1/3 is women. However, the more normalized and mainstream parties have a much smaller gender gap. And then generally they're lower educated, not necessarily poorer. In fact, there is a sizable portion in the electorate of far-right parties that does not have a college education, but has a very decent salary. This is in part because it includes older workers, but also kind of shop owners, for example. Right? And so, but as said, there are a lot of differences. And I think that's important because that also means that you have to be careful to see something in one country and then say, well, that will happen here too, because there are just massive differences, not only in the supply of the far right, but of course also the context. Now, let me first say that the US is obviously unique, as every country is unique, but the US has a uniquely difficult political system. And it is true that Europeans know much more about the US than Americans know about Europe. At the same time, I would argue that Europeans also a bit exaggerate their own knowledge about the US. One of the things I suffer whenever I go to Europe is I'm being America-splained by people who tell me how the life in America is. And yes, like you get a lot of information about it, but quite often the media is pretty decent on covering the parties, but very poor on covering the system. And so one of the things is the US is a federal system, but a much stronger federal system than anything else. It has also an extremely strong Supreme Court, and it is virtually impossible to change the Constitution. And that has massive consequences of what you can and cannot do in US politics. And actually, it explains to a large extent why Trump is ruling by executive order, which is very interesting because an executive order is pretty much just a statement. It holds no or very little legal power. The only reason why Trump at the moment can govern by executive order is because the Republicans in Congress allow him to. If they would say, we don't want this, then nothing happens, which is why the midterms in 2 years are so important. Right? Should it shift, then all these executive orders become just pieces of paper. Let's go to January 6th. I think we all remember. It was a pretty important day, 2021. A coup d'etat, a weird coup d'etat in many ways. I think January 6th is misunderstood in many circles. I don't think it was a planned coup d'etat. I don't think it showed necessarily the strength of the far right. Anyone who has ever gone, and I'm going to guesstimate not too many people, to a fairly rowdy soccer game and war among hooligans, will know that there is a crowd function, that once a mob starts to move, all kind of people who would never ever dream of being involved in that start to move with them. The people that ended up in Congress, like, if you would have asked them probably a day before, like, would you storm Congress? They would have said, of course not. That's insane, right? But once the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys started to move, and importantly, once the police, Capitol Police, didn't actually hold them out, everything just rolled. And the real reason why the Capitol was stormed was the fact that Trump was in power. And Trump didn't want to bring in the National Guard, which he now very happily disperses through California. Had there been the National Guard, 2,000 National Guard, no one would have breached that. Now, January 6th was an amazing 3 weeks. I think it was 3 weeks. Let's say 4. On the day, the days after, virtually every single Republican of note came out against it. And then without any clear indication why, because Trump himself was actually a bit absent, everything shifted. And within weeks, within the whole Republican Party, it now became legitimate protest. It became even free speech. People started to talk about it as a touristic excursion. The person who represents my town, for example, who is also on video trying to barricade the Senate room to keep them out. And so out of nowhere, from an attempt to kind of get rid of the extremism and Trump, they went full-on extremist, supporting, embracing what was a coup d'etat. But what was also important, that the real coup d'etat was actually inside of Congress. Because inside of Congress, there was a significant minority of Republican members of Congress who voted against the the official recognition of the 2020 election results. So what happened, weirdly enough, Trump himself kind of started to disappear a bit in those first 2 years. And during the midterms, the majority of Republicans wanted the party to move on from Trump. The midterms were very bad for Trump candidates, and Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, was the new man. It was the man where all the money was, where all the establishment support was. The Wall Street Journal, the Koch brothers, Fox News, every poll that Republicans did were all favoring DeSantis. And then DeSantis imploded, because DeSantis was a terrible candidate, and because I think particularly DeSantis had exactly the same problem as Clinton, namely Trump. Trump has one thing, and that is authenticity. Trump says whatever he wants, and it is real. He lies, but even that is real, because when he lies, he thinks it's true, right? And honestly, it is remarkable. I mean, it's very rare, and I cannot remember any other politician ever in my life that is so authentic. And that makes professional politicians like Hillary Clinton and Ron DeSantis look terrible. Every attempt at authenticity looks so fake next to him. And so DeSantis, who is really the most plastic of the politicians that we had out there, like, just was nothing in that era. And so the weird thing was, and it's really interesting, you should go back to all of the coverage in the weeks after the midterms. Trump was dead. We had moved on. Trump announced that he was going to run. It was an extremely boring press conference at Mar-a-Lago. It was what he would himself call low energy. And it was so bad that Fox News moved away. Live, halfway, they were just like, okay, we can't do this anymore. Like, others have moved on before, but Fox News moved. And so that is the point where we are halfway. And it's important because too much of the discourse about Trump is kind of Trump Superman. Trump is this unique figure that has characteristics that make people devote to him. If that were to be the case, we wouldn't be at that situation. So the implosion of DeSantis is very important. He became a liability for big money. And Trump returns and then gets people shooting at him, gave a huge momentum, I think just as the stabbing of Bolsonaro had done before. But most importantly, the Democrats self-destructed. After a massive campaign by particularly the New York Times, Biden became pretty much no longer defensible, which not necessarily take a position on that. Obviously, he hadn't deteriorated recently. He was exactly the same as they were 2 years ago. The thing is, the midterms were seen as good for the Democratic Party. And so Biden, who can blame him, said, that's me. Right? So I should run for another term. And then, what was it, 5 months or something before the election, they push him out, leaving only one candidate, Kamala Harris, who was not necessarily the strongest candidate, but who ran a decent campaign. But the campaign was written for Biden, an old white man, seen as centrist. And now you had a black woman, who is by definition seen as radical. So in the end, importantly, the election was lost by the Democrats. Right? Trump won a little bit. The Democrats lost almost 7 million votes compared to 2020. So when we talk about the power of Trump, right, we should always contextualize it. In part, he is the one eye in the land of the blind. Now, what has happened? Trump 1.0 was a right-wing coalition. It was a coalition between the old Republican Party, personified by Mitch McConnell, still then a powerful leader in Congress, and the far right surrounded around Trump. It only got done those things where they agreed. So Trump 1.0 was very successful in tax cuts for the rich, which both Trump and McConnell supported, deregulation, same thing, and defunding of the state. Everything else that was specific to Trump was either completely unsuccessful, the wall, he barely built anything, or modestly successful, the so-called economic nationalism. But after losing, so when he came to power, he had no infrastructure. There was no Trumpian party structure, but there was also not really a prominent far-right element within the Republican Party yet. That changed, of course, during his power, but then in opposition, a lot has changed too. And so by the time that Trump runs again, we have a complete marginalization of the old right. The American Enterprise Institution has for decades been the most powerful and most relevant right-wing think tank. It is completely sidelined. Like, when it organizes events, only liberals come. It has no connections to the Trump administration. But there's also been a transformation of some key institutions. College Republicans, for example, the college Republicans at my university split over Trump in 2016. They're completely pro-Trump in 2020 and 2024. But the most important institution is the Heritage Foundation. And Heritage is also a long-standing think tank, which was mostly a policy factory that wrote policies for fossil fuel industry and whatever. It was very conservative in small government, pro-business, etc. Particularly the last couple of years, they have a new leader called Kevin Roberts, who is openly far-right and who is very close to Orban and others. And Heritage today is just a far-right organization. There's virtually not a Republican left in the old school one. And we have had a whole host of new organizations that are not in any way created by Trump or even led by him, but who support his agenda. The most important from me as an academic is Turning Point USA, which is a student group, which also has a professor watch list, for example. At most universities today, if there's any right-wing activity, it is through TPUSA. It's not through college Republicans. They're completely irrelevant. Now, this is an organization of Charlie Kirk, who is very close to Trump, and particularly his son. It's a very large organization. There are other organizations, mostly of people who played major roles in Trump 1.0. Think about Stephen Miller, who has his own think tank, other think tanks. So at the moment, you have a whole far-right infrastructure, which by and large has replaced the traditional Republican infrastructure. Again, it's important they are not necessarily Trumpian organizations. And so whereas Orban has full control over Fidesz and everything related to Fidesz, that is not the case with Trump. Actually, Trump probably barely knows these organizations exist. Trump 2.0 is solidly far-right. There's virtually not an element in it that isn't far-right. But it is not homogeneously far-right. It is a very diverse coalition of various versions of far-right, ranging from Christian nationalists to pure white supremacists who don't care about religion, to techno-fascists, to pretty much everything. And importantly, while working together, as in the often mentioned Project 2025, Project 2025 was a project by Heritage, but pretty much all the different far-right groups could get something in it. But it is completely unclear who has power and for how long. And one of the best examples of that is Elon Musk, right? Who goes from all-powerful, allegedly it was Elon Musk who was the real president and Trump was the puppet. And then Elon Musk was gone. In Trump 1.0, Steve Bannon was allegedly president and Trump was the puppet. And then Steve Bannon was gone, right? And so the only one who holds power is Trump. And if you're not in a good book with Trump, you have no basis. Social media. Social media is an obsessive focus of other media, as well as of young people. Everything started with Twitter. Not young people, because they're not on Twitter. But everything started with social media. As Austrians, you should know that there was a far right before social media. A very strong far right before social media. Social media mostly radicalized people who were already in the far right camp or potential far right camp. Social media is echo chambers. But it's not. This idea of echo chambers is there's someone who has absolutely no visions. There are no priors. They just go on Twitter, they see Musk, and they become a Nazi. That's not how influence works. Most people who have no visions and interest in politics are not on Twitter, first of all. Most active people on Twitter are very political. They don't change. They seek other people who have their views. And so the only thing that that does, to a certain extent, is they radicalize it, because you're all the time confirmed, and it can shift the focus. So not so much your position, but now, because you are for white people, you are against the Democrats, you are against the liberal order, but now you're for Putin, because that is at the moment what you're busy with. And then you go to another issue. But fundamentally, you stay ideologically the same. So that's what social media largely does. Most of the more solid research on social media influence, particularly on electoral behavior, shows that it has a very small impact. About 10% of Trump voters were influenced by it. And that is about, I would say, 2% of American people in 2016. Tech bros, I've made my point about Musk and Bannon. I'm not saying that Musk is completely irrelevant or can't come back. He's groveling at the moment, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. Also, I'm very concerned of what information he has acquired over the last months. But outside of that, he has actually done very little. He has defunded all kinds of organizations. Most would have been defunded by virtually any other Republican they all hate the same type of institutions. The tech bros are actually also very heterogeneous. Like Elon Musk is very different from Peter Thiel. Like Peter Thiel, who pays your former prime minister, is someone who believes pretty much in techno-fascism. He believes that like some smart people should rule the world and innovate it like into prosperity. Elon Musk is clearly a white supremacist. Zuckerberg has very little political agenda, seems mostly aggrieved that people don't see him as a genius, right? And then you have Google people who just want to make money, and Bezos, right? And so they're all over the place. They hate each other, like, but they also hate the left, the Democrats even more. Sometimes this one is in favor, sometimes that one is in favor. In the end, the only one who decides who is in favor is Trump. I think overall social media still more reflects society than that it shapes it. The radicalization that you see on social media is the radicalization that we have seen in society in the last decades. The radicalization didn't start on social media, it started on Christian radio, it started on talk radio in the US, and then through Fox. Like, it's not Musk, it's Rush Limbaugh, who you might not know, but Rush Limbaugh transformed the US far more than Elon Musk ever did, and he was this right-wing talk radio host. And I lived for a while in Indiana when I would drive up from roughly Indianapolis to South Bend, where Notre Dame University is. As soon as you're 10, 15 miles out of Indianapolis, you only have two types of radio, which is right-wing talk radio and Christian radio. And they, by and large, have the same message, right? And so radio is far more important in the US than people realize. The power of social media is indirect. It is the social media sets the agenda of the traditional media. The fact is that most journalists and politicians are extremely online. Now it has changed a little bit with Twitter, but that took a long time. But for a very long time, journalists thought that Twitter was the real world. That Twitter was where you saw what people truly thought. That they wouldn't say that in public, but there it was the authentic kind of world. Now, we actually know that Twitter is a very small part of the world. First of all, almost no one under 30 is on it. Second of all, I think about, what was it, 1% of the users of Twitter create 80% of the content. Right? So it's an extremely skewed world, which is particularly right-wing and reactionary. However, whatever happens on Twitter comes into the mainstream media. And so Trump didn't win in 2016 because of Twitter, he won because of CNN and the New York Times. Because mainstream media all the time talked about what he did on Twitter. If they wouldn't have done that, then 2 million people, the people who followed him, might have read it. Of those 2 million, let's take out 500,000 of political scientists and journalists and just freaks who like to see crazy stuff. Right? The rest would be people who were solidly Trump already. So no influence in there. So social media today mostly has influence because of traditional media. And if you want to talk about media influence, for me, what is much more important in the rise of the far right is the privatization of traditional media. If we would still have traditional media linked to churches, trade unions, or the state in general, without a neoliberal logic in it, then all of these things that happen on social media would be filtered. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying that at the moment, the media picks up on everything because everything is about profit. And the profit margin of media is this. They're all the time close to bankruptcy. And so they jump on everything they think is important. And again, they think what is online is important. The counter strategies. I think this is the one thing that particularly I notice in European media, as well as from my European friends, is something that has been shocking. First of all, you have commercial or corporate compliance. It's important that Trump 1 was also embraced by big business, particularly stock market business. Now, to be fair, Trump 1 had a narrative that Trump was irrelevant and that the adults in the room were going to make sure that he wouldn't do something stupid. We don't have adults in the room anymore. But the market is happy with Trump, or was until he started the tariffs. And you can see the stock market boom after he wins. There's nothing surprising. This is not a Marxist theory of fascism. Fascism are not like the boot boys of capitalism. Capitalism always hedges its bet. And so big business gives both to the Democrats and the Republicans. But once in power, you will work with power. The media has clearly shifted. And this has to do with two things, in my opinion. First of all, owner structure. Washington Post and Bezos, LA Times and someone other, businessmen. These are people who make a lot of money doing business with the state. They often lose money on their newspaper. They're not going to risk their business over the newspaper. The second thing is that in 2016, Trump won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote by 2.5 million votes. And so there was this argument that we have to accept him, but he's not really representing the majority. In election night, Trump had more than 50% of the vote. In the end, it is actually a little bit less. But that created the narrative of he has a popular mandate. And so the argument now was he speaks for the American people, as if the other 50% no longer counts. And that played a major role. And the New York Times is very clear on that. It's all the time arguing that position. But what it also, of course, does is that it downplays discontent. It downplays the protests that are there. It normalizes, and I think that's very important, the Trump regime and he himself. Trump has just an onslaught of absolutely batshit crazy social media posts or activities. This is not about the politics of it. This is purely about how he responds. We have seen the Zelensky, we have the Truth Social post. If anyone else does that, you have a whole debate of, is this guy still fully there, right? We don't have that on Trump. We have had a year of daily articles about, is Biden still there? Is he too old? Biden drops out, the whole issue of age, gone, right? The whole issue of dementia, gone. And so those are important things. The Democratic Party today is less popular than the Republican Party. Just let that sink in. Usually when you have someone who is just all over the place, you just have to sit. You just do a Keir Starmer, and by and large don't say anything, and you roll into power. The Democrats kind of do that, and yet are still historically unpopular. One, because they were initially also buying into the same popular mandate. Well, he won the majority, so we have to listen to him. Two, the leadership, as far as there is a leadership, but Chuck Schumer, for example, is completely out of date with pretty much everything. The leadership of the Democratic Party is very old. But also, the Democratic Party has a very heterogeneous base. much more heterogeneous than the Republican Party. The electorate of the Republican Party, I think, is about 70% white, is probably even larger Christian and finding religion important, right? Is anti-left, is concerned about the same type of things. The Democratic electorate is pretty much a representation in racial terms of the electorate. It still is a plurality white, but it has 82% of African American voters, probably 90% of African American women, quite a lot of Hispanics, etc. They're all over the place on many issues. Right? And so on Gaza, they were split. The electorate of the Democratic Party was split on Gaza almost 50-50 for the first year. The electorate of the Republican Party was probably 90% pro-Israel, 10% anti. It's a basic anti-Semitic kind of electorate. Right? And the other 90% is just whatever. Right? Israel can do whatever. So it's very easy to take a position on that. Harris could not have taken a position in the election that would have won her. Right? If she would have been strongly pro-Israel, she would have won a little bit of support from some Jewish voters. But the American Jews that care a lot about Israel are largely Republican now. The American Jewish population is increasingly split. And so there are other issues where they're also very divided, including issues that have to do with race. Actually, I would say what American political scientists call racial conservatism, what I would call racism, is remarkably widespread among white voters of Democratic parties. Like whenever I see a survey about nativist views or racist views, I see the percentage of Republicans and I think, yeah, sure. And then you see that the Democrats is only 20% lower. You're like, right? And so any type of welfare program is actually pretty tricky for a Democratic Party. There's a passivity of the public. It's not unique to the US. My country, the Netherlands, the country of ultimate complacency, right, had a far-right government, didn't seem to bother anyone, just moved on. In the US, that's not the case. Like in the Netherlands, there are actually the vast majority things, it's fine, we'll manage. Huge portion of Americans are very concerned. They don't come out. Now, why is that? Now, let's not forget that this is a humongous country. Right? So if you organize a protest in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, then the largest trip that anyone has to do is 2.5 hours. And that would be almost impossible. Right? If I go to my city, I drive 1.5 hours. I drive 1.5 hours to get to the airport. Right? If I drive to DC, that's 13 hours. And I live on the East Coast. So like, it's enormous. Organizing anything requires so much effort. And if it doesn't happen in DC or New York, it doesn't happen. Right? You can bring together 100,000 people in whatever, Boulder, Colorado, like, but there are no journalists in Boulder, Colorado. So it has to happen there. So that plays a role. But I also think civil society in the US is indeed very large, as Alex de Tocqueville already wrote in the late 19th century. But it mostly performs tasks that in Europe are done by the state. They're not anti-state. They're not to check the state. They're actually replacing the state. Churches take care of food. Right? They are the social, like, hangnet. And that plays a role. And so civil society, on average, is not actually involved in opposing the state. Even in Black Lives Matter, for example, was a spontaneous movement. Most of the traditional civil society only came later. We always think back to the civil rights movement, which was an amazing movement, but also the exception to the rule. So the public is leaderless. There's no leadership in the Democratic Party. There's no leadership in civil society. And they're overwhelmed. And I think it is important to realize that Trump is not Kickel. Trump is not Wilders. It is at a level so much more extreme, with a state so powerful, particularly in terms of repression, that to just deal with that eats up your energy. Like it is just every single day you wake up, and there is something happening that requires all your energy of a week. Just think about what's happening at the moment in California. Partly a side story, but because at the same time he's still destroying universities and going after judges and like having razzias that put people in Sudan. But he's now bringing Marines to California, which is unconstitutional, but it's nevertheless happening. He's now ordering riots or ICE in democratically controlled cities, hoping that there will be similar responses as in LA, so that he can proclaim the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to use the US military forces on US soil, right? That's not just a scandal. That's not Ibiza, right? That goes to the core, and we have that on a daily basis. So it's very difficult to find your target. I think that's why Musk was so important. And so this is a protest in my town, and it was a protest across the US in everything town. It was actually a fairly decent turnout. But one of the things that was very typical was that almost everyone's focused on Musk. Musk was a very good target. He's very easy to hate, right? But at the same time, Musk is gone, right? And so this whole cause is kind of lost. But if you protest almost anything, 2 days later, it doesn't exist anymore. Gaza plan, gone. Muslim ban, gone. And so when you have so many moving targets, it's just incredibly hard. There's no overarching topic, because when the Women's March happened, which was still the largest protest in US history, it had a very clear agenda: abortion. Right? That was the trigger. Today you're all over the place. That being said, there are a lot of small protests. The problem is they're all local, and the media is uninterested. Even on this day that we had protests across the US in really significant numbers, it took until well into the afternoon for national media to start to cover it. And on social media, you could already see pictures of massive demonstrations. But the media is uninterested. Now, are there lessons for Europe? Again, let me state that the US is a unique country in terms of its size, incredibly complex system. I would say also extremely high tolerance for racism, which is not to say that Europeans don't have it, but they have not as long of a history. I think what is fundamental is that we rethink far-right politics. We still think about the far right being there. The far right is something that only the far right does. Far right politics is whatever the far right says. Anyone who's not far right doesn't do far right politics. That's not how the world works anymore. Right? Here we have Meloni, the most successful far right politician in Europe today, and Frederiksen, allegedly a social democrat from Denmark, who are spearheading yet another anti-immigration plan. Right? Fredrickson is the darling of the far right today. Nativist politics come from everywhere. So the far right is not a skinhead. Like even today in the newspaper, when you see a picture around the story of the far right, it is often like some kind of skinhead with like a swastika tattooed on the back of his head. Like, as I tell my students, it's your grandpa or your uncle. Right? But the mainstream is also not that liberal democratic bloc that is anti-racist, that is pro-tolerance, that sees the far right as something very different. The mainstream includes the far right in most cases. Right? And it includes far right issues. And so if you fight far right politics, you also fight in part the mainstream. And one of the problems I have with what is called anti-fascist politics, or whatever you want to call it, is that they often are extremely critical about the far right. Whatever the far right says is seen as an indication of their racism, and very forgiving towards mainstream parties. When mainstream parties introduce nativist politics and say, well, we have to do it, otherwise the far right comes, everyone says, oh yeah, no, we have to do that. What does it matter who introduces the racist politics? The problem is the racist politics. So we have to prepare. Austria, not the best example, right? You've had some experience, but we all know that you will have another government coming. They're going to govern one day again, whether it's Kickel or someone else. Clearly, the Democrats were completely unprepared for Trump 2.0. Also, European leaders were completely unprepared for Trump 2.0, which I think is just criminal incompetence. As we have done with the far right for decades, we just try to wish them away. And so when they come, then we have to start to think about, okay, so what should we defend? Right? Now, I think if I would interview 100 leading politicians and ask, what is liberal democracy? Like, what are the core values, core institutions? I think probably a sizable portion will fail that exam. But particularly if you look at the discourse of politicians today, it's a very narrow majoritarian type discourse. It is a discourse where the people are homogeneous, where the people are more conservative than the people really are. We have actually empirical research that shows that both journalists and politicians think that the population is much more right-wing than they actually are. Right? And so liberal democracy is about majority rule and minority rights. The majority cannot do everything. It is about independence media and independence of judiciary. Those are fundamental. Any aspect of that, undermining that, for whatever reason, goes to the core of liberal democracy. Right? If you don't understand that, then you can't set red lines. And one of the things that we see is that parties start to work with the far right, either in government or making laws, and not really thinking it through. They think, well, this policy doesn't do anything bad. But the underlying ideology of that policy does actually go against minority rights or against pluralism, which means that logically the next policy is going to undermine liberal democracy. And finally, I think what is absolutely crucial is that liberal Democrats, whatever their specific ideology is, should start setting the agenda again. The agenda has been set by the far right for almost the whole 21st century. Since 9/11, we have been talking about national identity. We have talked about the failure of multiculturalism. We have talked about the threat, security threat of immigration, the lack of immigration, all these kind of things. Even now we're talking about climate change having gone too far. Also a discourse that comes from the EPP, but has very strong far-right elements in it. We have an agenda of don't vote for the far right, or the far right are fascist, or the far right are racist, particularly towards minorities or marginalized groups, right? They know. They actually know much better than us, non-minorities, and they know much longer. Right? There's no African American who thinks that Trump is not a racist. Right? The point is that they're not convinced that the Democrats are not racist. And the Democrats do not actually offer them anything to believe that they're not racist. So anti-fascism can always only be part of the struggle. The struggle is to strengthen democracy. Because in the end, like, the far right is not the cause of the problems of democracy. It is the consequence of it. We have a far right because people are not happy with the way liberal democracy functions. And if you ban them, people are still not happy with the way liberal democracy functions. However, if you make people happier about the way that liberal democracy functions, you will have less far right. Right? Now, how do you do that? Not by ignoring so-called far-right issues. Of course, you have to talk about immigration, because it is a concern. But you can talk about immigration in all kinds of different ways. For example, if you talk about asylum seekers, human rights issue. If you talk about immigrants, you can talk about aging populations. You can talk about welfare state. You can also talk, if you're more conservative, about limiting it and having a light culture, whatever you want to do. That is not necessarily undemocratic or against liberal democracy. But you have to do it within that context, right? Alternative issues and positions are also about who are you trying to reach. All parties these days are trying to find the same voter, by and large, which is an older white, mostly men, who is reactionary and potentially votes for the far right. All except of the Greens, right? And here neos, right? Niche parties who have niche electorates. But the mainstream right, the mainstream left, and the far right are obsessed with the same voter. The problem for the mainstream left, Social Democrats, is that that voter is not going to vote for you. You didn't lose them, and you're not going to win them. Now, the voter that you should chase are young women. Young women are far more progressive than anyone else, women or men. Young women care about the issues that traditionally social democratic parties care about, including welfare state and just state in general, climate change, etc., etc., etc. Right? And young women vote less than other groups. So they're a huge potential electorate. And they're young, which means that they can vote for a long time. Unlike the average electorate of social democratic parties, which is old and dies off by every election. And so if that isn't enough to clip the focus to young women, then I don't know what is. Thank you.
Speech and also for offering some lessons and learnings in the end. I have so many questions prepared, but we are running a little late. And I think it's good because I think this kind of speech needed some more time that we usually grant an introductory speech. but therefore I will cut my own questions short and have a look in the audience. You can think about your questions. I have one question before we go to the audience. I know now that you're not a regular reader of news for reasons I can fully understand, but you also mentioned what is going on in California right now. And the background is that in recent days, protests emerged in Los Angeles and in and around LA. ICE raids happened. ICE is the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement agency, and they conducted large-scale workplace raids to find illegal immigrants, basically. You mentioned the National Guard, which Trump did not send to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, but he did send them to LA, despite the governor not consenting to this, without the okay, or without the consultation with the law enforcement on the ground. And furthermore, he sent in the Marine Corps. And there's a difference as well, because they are a part of the armed forces. And the Marines are usually the ones who go into a war the first. You know, these are the infantry which will be sent in. So they are basically trained to kill and to fight wars, but they are not trained to to disperse protests or to handle protests and large crowds like that. So obviously this is an escalation, and what I would like to ask you is to contextualize this escalation, because what we also see is a rhetoric which is deeply dehumanizing. Trump is talking about about an invasion. He's referring to the protesters as animals, etc. pp. What do we see? How would you contextualize this kind of behavior and rhetoric?
So it's very important to contextualize, to know that the National Guard is called in pretty regularly. Now, what is different here, and particularly when non-white people protest. And so we had the National Guard in my town on campus. When Black Lives Matter protests were in my town, nothing happens. And so you had, like, I don't know, several hundred there. So during Black Lives Matter, National Guard was everywhere, but there are so many other cases. That's not uncommon. It is uncommon that the federal government overrules the state government, because the federalist system is very strong. What is very important to realize is that this is the absolute wet dream for the far right, what is happening. Helped by the media, there is this picture going around of a Hispanic guy with a Mexican flag on a bicycle in front of a burning car. I mean, that is gold. Because what that says is, A, democratic cities are out of control. Nothing more scary for authoritarians than a lack of order. And these people are not American. After all, they have a Mexican flag. So they choose even not to be American, right? And so this is absolute gold for them. At the same time, there is huge tolerance of violence in the US as a whole. And the US is an incredibly violent society. On every weekend, dozens of people are being shot in just random violence. In Chicago alone, the South Side, more people are being killed at times than in Iraq. So there's a tolerance for violence that's huge, particularly towards the undeserving, which is happening now. That being said, even within the right, there is also this fear of the tyranny of the federal state. And so as long as they can find excuses to use violence, and the violence is against mostly young people who are not white, I think they can do almost whatever they want. But if for example, young white women, mothers who come in solidarity are being beaten up, then it can change. And so I think what he tries to do, as said, is he tries to provoke a riot. And riot is something that is created by the media, right? Because it depends where you take the picture. If you take the picture very close, it looks as if the whole town is burning. If you go 100 steps back, you see that one spot is burning. And so at the moment it's riots. The term is also riots the whole time, right? There's no debate about what ICE is doing. And so I worry about that. At the same time, I don't think this is fascism. This is also not un-American. This is as American as almost anything. This is what happens. And also this distinction between the Marines and the regular law enforcement is not as big. I mean, police in the US is absolutely militarized. On top of that, a lot of people who work in particularly SWAT and riot police are former military. And so that when you see at times police walking around, when I go to a game of Atlanta United, there will be people in complete combat outfit with semi-automatics standing there. On the back it just says police, right? And so that difference is just not that big. What this shows mostly is there is no opposition within the right to Trump. He can literally do anything, and we have the senator from Texas, Tom Cotton, who is always very excited to use force. He wanted to invade Venezuela before. He now wrote in the Wall Street Journal that we should really send in the troops. And so until deserving people get killed, right, I think he has massive leeway, particularly in a state like California or New York, which are not seen as real America by much of the Republican electorate.
So I see at least 3 hands. I'll start here in the second row. Please use the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to know if the far right is transnational, or should it be more research in national context because it's so different per country? That's my question.
Thank you. First row, please. We collect 3 questions and then we will do other rounds.
My one question is, at the first time of Trump, Steve Bannon said, sorry, it was him, flood the zone with shit. Then you said now that there are always issues coming up, shortly coming up and then going away. Is this the new flood the zone with shit? And second, I have only, is there any institution that could hold Trump's actions? In Austria, if somebody acts weird, you can do einstweilige Verfügung if it's private. No, if it's private, to stop the action until it is decided, because, I mean, the courts take years to decide, and then it is done already.
There's something I do not understand about Trump's role on one side as a president and on the other side as a businessman. Because what he's been doing with the tariffs, in my opinion, has offered him so many chances to make a great deal of money in his function as a businessman, which, from my understanding of a regular state function, it should be illegal. Does he still have all his strange businesses, and is that compatible? That's one question. And one other short question. I would really appreciate it if you could say something about the European Parliament. You only mentioned the EPP. Maybe you can say a couple of more words about that.
Is there anything specific you would like to know about the European Parliament? I mean,
especially the right factions.
Oh, mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Let me first say that I'm very pleased about the gender composition of the first questions. It's very rare that the first question is not asked by men. Far right is transnational. Depends a little bit. To a certain extent, almost everything is transnational now because of social media. And so you do see much quicker and much more adaptation, copying of language. Like think about fake news, how quickly that was adopted everywhere. At the same time, it's not that those far right that use the term fake news now didn't think that news was fake news before. They just didn't use the term fake news, right? And so it often is a very shallow influence. Research on the far right in social media shows that the only things that are transnationally shared are about immigration. And it's mostly from parties, not from individuals. So for me personally, to understand the far right, and particularly in terms of elections, they are national first, always. Like no one, by and large, votes in German elections in a certain way because Americans voted in another way. Most elections are decided on dynamics in that specific country. While the far right is much better connected than it was, again, the connections are much shallower. Like, how difficult is it to retweet someone? Right? And that you can see as a connection. You couldn't do that in the 80s. So the only people who were connected were people who actually wrote letters or met with each other, which directly meant that they had a much stronger contact. The US far right has always been very parochial, as the whole US has always been very parochial. The far right is better connected. The question is, what does it mean? Sure, everyone goes to Hungary because Orban pays a lot of money for you to come. Do they go there and study what Orban does? Probably not. Most of them because they wouldn't understand what he's doing. And most of them because they're Americans. What can you learn from Hungary? Right? So I still think that compared to social democratic parties, for example, far-right parties are much less connected. But more than before. Flooding the zone with shit, Bannon, again, right? I personally don't think that Trump is doing that. Sometimes he does it. Trump needs attention. Like that, he had that as a businessman. It is in his personality. He needs to be the center of attention. He wants to make the news. And that's why he throws in things. As soon as he had that interest, right, he is no longer interested in the thing. Because if you say it the second time, you don't create the same thing. It's also the reason why he goes after Harvard and not the University of Georgia. Because if you go after the University of Georgia, no one cares. If you go after Harvard, everyone cares. And so it is, I don't like pathologizing politics, right? But in this case, it is one person. And Trump has a very long history of wanting to be, and he believes also, it's a very American story, he believes in that. He believes that TV and branding is everything. That's his whole career, right? Are there any counterforces? The GOP. The Republican Party can stop almost everything now. Are they going to do it? No. Are they never going to do it? No. As soon as he is vulnerable, as soon as it's clear that various people are risking their seat because of Trump, they will. It's a matter of pretty much 1, 2 people standing up and making him look weak. And then others will follow. But that first one, right? The courts, for all the complaining, the courts are still holding up. Almost every single case he's losing. Is that going to last? I don't know. Because if you read the judgments, particularly of the Supreme Court, well, they almost never take issue with the idea. Even though the ideas are often unconstitutional too. for some reason, despite having a lot of people with Harvard and Yale degrees from law school, they seem incapable in writing a half-decent law. And so most of these things are thrown out on technicalities, which is what the Supreme Court, it's easy for the Supreme Court, right? Say, look, I'm not judging what you want to do, but this is just not good work. Do it again. We're going to see in half a year or so if they come up with a well-written unconstitutional law, whether the Supreme Court is going to stand up. Now, don't be necessarily pessimistic, because if the midterms create a backlash, that will influence what the Supreme Court does. Corruption. Corruption is always the key story. It doesn't mean that they can't be ideological and corrupt, right? But corruption is the key story to Orban. Orban is a kleptocracy. Erdogan is a kleptocracy. The Trump empire is a kleptocracy, and it plays a major role. One of the key reasons why people like Erdogan and Orban will try to stay in power forever is because if they don't, they and their family are going to prison. The main reason I believe that Trump ran again was because he was afraid to go to prison. He has no interest in politics. But now that he is in power, he made, I think, was it 2 or 4 billion since coming to power. The tariffs are very clearly a strategy for people to shortchange and on the stock market. The problem is things are illegal, but that's irrelevant until someone enforces it. And if no one enforces it, it can still be illegal, and you can do it until the end. That's the situation where we are. Right? And he's remarkably open about his corruption. This reminds me, for the older people with some knowledge of Central and Eastern Europe, the Slovaks had a leader called Vladimir Mečiar in the 1990s. And he was the antithesis of the Czech leader, who was Václav Klaus, who at that point in time was an insane and was seen as the kind of the Thatcherite politician, reliable, pro-business, right? And so there was no corruption in the Czech Republic, whereas at the same time, Mečiar was open about his corruption. Why? Because that was the basis of his model. Mečiar was the old kind of leader who provided clientelist services. Right? That's what Trump does. Right? Trump is open about his corruption because that's literally what he said. Back me and I deliver. Right? Give me your money, I give you lower taxes. Right? Give me your money, I make sure that your industry is deregulated. That's just this kind of mafioso way of doing politics. It has always worked. Remember, he comes out of the real estate world, which is a very dubious type of world. And if you talk about businessmen, people think he's a businessman, but the real estate world is very different from most business. It is very small in terms of people, but makes massive deals. Right? So if you look at the money that is generated in his Trump, it is enormous. But most of these involve only a few people. Trump has never known anything else. His dad did this, and this is what he did. So obviously, that is how he behaves. And how does he behave? By bullying people. Everyone who has worked with Trump will tell you that that is what he does. He storms into the room, demands something, and then violence bluffs and hopes that they will do it. And he gets away, and if not, goes bankrupt, comes back. Right? And so that's how he is a politician. And the most amazing thing is, it works. European Parliament, not too much to say over the last several elections, like European politics. It has moved to the right, which is to do with the EPP. But the EPP is also just a reflection of the individual member parties. And the majority of the individual member parties of the EPP, the center-right group, works with the far right at the national level. So obviously, there is a lot of people in the EPP who wants to work with the far right at the European level. it was absolutely clear from the beginning, even before the elections, I think, that the far right was going to win, but not as much as everyone predicted, but that the right wing would have a majority. And given that within the EPP, the power has shifted over the last years. So many of the parties are now much more in Central and Eastern Europe, and South, they are the more right-wing parties within the EPP. And in this new world, the right wing of the EPP is the power broker. Because they determine, they can govern with both the far right and with the center. And it was going to be clear that the EPP still they prefer to work with the mainstream parties. Because that's more reliable and they know how it is. But they can use the threat of the so-called Venezuela coalition to work together with the far right to renew the liberals and socialists and Democrats to accept more right-wing policies. And so they're just perfect. But it's not, it goes from the national to the European rather than the other way around.
I see one more hand, 2, 3, and I have 4, and I have also a small question. I mean, I think nobody would object to your analysis that Trump is being corrupt and it's a kleptocracy, but don't you think there's any ideology or any political goal behind this whole project?
It is said that when Angela Merkel met Trump in his first administration, for preparation, she read an interview with Trump from 1989 in Playboy. And so she actually read Playboy for the interviews. There was at least one person. I've read the interview. I suggest you do it too. It is incredible. Almost everything that he said then, he still says today. His obsession about the Europeans, particularly the Germans, taking advantage of America, the racism, all of that. It's not ideological in the political sense. It's much more instinctive. Trump is an authoritarian, he is a racist, he is an anti-Semite. We have that all documented. He prefers Jewish accountants because Jews are good with money. That you can't get more anti-Semitic than that, right? But he never thinks about politics. So he has no project. There are a lot of different people with projects, but the projects are all different, right? And so I personally don't even think that he's necessarily looking for a white US. He's a white supremacist, right? Which means that you're okay with a multiracial country as long as it is governed by and according to white values. That's not extreme in US history. That is pretty much US history. He is very flexible on a lot of things, from LGBTQI rights to economics to a certain extent, right? So it's not that he's necessarily in favor of tariffs. He wants what he thinks is fair trade, right? And so Orban, I have discussions with people who know Orban from the early Fidesz days, and they're adamant that Orban has no ideology, that Orban is only about power. I'm not so sure about that. I think Orban was always a nationalist, a Hungarian nationalist, but I also think that Hungarian nationalism is Trianon trauma and the idea that Hungary is greater than the current state is shared by the vast majority of Hungarians, and particularly in the 1990s, by the majority of parties. He's an authoritarian. I think that was also always there. But first and foremost, it's about power.
Okay. Thank you. So I have seen 4 hands.
I have 2 questions. First, I would like to follow up the California matter. So Newsom naturally has said, we are able to do it ourselves. That means that the states would like to see that they do their business themselves. And this is an interest which not only California has, but all the states have the interest that their rights are respected by the president and should tell him quite clearly, please keep out of our business. The same is true with the Congress and the tariff policy. It was said that the tariff policy is a matter for the Congress. So the Congress should show more self-respect and should tell him, please keep out, do your business. The universities have an interest that he does not all the time intervene in their business. So there should be a unity, I think, of interested states, of Congress, of universities, all telling him, do your business. You are not able to do your business. Where is your promise with regard to the Russian-Ukrainian peace? We don't see any trace of it. Where is the peace which you have promised in the Israeli-Palestinian war? No result at all. You have promised that you come to an agreement with Iran. Up to now, there is no agreement with Iran. Please do your business and keep out your nose of our business. We do our business and you do your business. And it would be good if all the 50 states and the Congress and the university would form an alliance against this type. And the second is very short.
Yeah. It's not a question.
This was the first.
Yeah, please.
Self-respect of own rights. The second is Musk has indicated that he would like to create a new party. Was this only a fake or a spontaneous idea? Or do you think that there is really a possibility that he creates a new party, which I would welcome? It should have the name of Center Party.
Okay, thank you. Please keep your questions short and simple. So, third row. Yeah,
Thank
okay.
you for this talk. What was very interesting. My question is, you mentioned dissatisfaction with liberal democracy is a major factor that helps the far right and strengthens it. Are there any innovations that you see?
Are there any what?
Innovations of democracy. Are there any tools that you have found anywhere that would be a counter trend to that?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
A very quick question. You spoke about young women and gaining them as voters. What I'm curious is young men. I think in the US election you see them trending to Republicans. I think you see that in other elections as well. What do you see there? Is there anything to be seen? I'm just curious.
I wanted to ask, because I have the impression that in Europe especially, left parties hold high standards. So you have to follow a certain set of beliefs to be considered left. And if you drop certain statements that are rather considered right, you might be excluded from certain circles of people. And would you say that that is also a factor in the US that pushed people to not vote Kamala Harris? Because, for example, a lot of African-American people didn't vote for her because, well, that just appeared strange to me. That's why I wanted to ask.
Thank you. We will take a two more, and then we close this round.
I always stumble over the term illiberal democracy. What do you think? I think we should stop using the term because it's not, illiberal democracy is still democracy. Are we kind of veiling something? Are we not, is this some kind of euphemism? What do you think?
Thank you. And the last question in the very back.
I'm interested in the lessons you draw for Europe. And my conclusion then, listening to you, is be prepared. And second, protect your institution, your democratic institutions. We have in Austria a FPÖ president of parliament. Is that a mistake? Maybe we should put these people in these positions.
Thank you very much.
Writing it down.
Yeah. Short but big questions.
Yeah. Impressive. Try to be short in my answers. Musk-owned party, irrelevant. He's already groveling for Trump. Also, there's no third party that's ever been successful. The system is set up in such a way that it's not only about money. You need such an infrastructure. Leaving aside his own personality and drug habit, like that's not happening. It's just democratic innovations. That's
state rights.
Well, that was more a statement rather than a question. So I took your statement, and it's fine.
Thank you.
Democratic innovations. I personally don't think that it's the system that is failing. I think it is the people within the system that is failing. There is unhappiness with political systems in all kind of different things. So for a long time we said, well, we can only stop the far right with a majoritarian electoral system, because in proportional electoral system, they get a chance to grow slowly, right? And then you get Trump. People say, well, people want more influence. Like, they don't just want to vote every 4 years, they want to be involved. That's mostly a certain group of people, higher educated people, people who already vote. The thing is that many of these initiatives of direct democracy or deliberative democracy are dominated by the same group that already dominate politics, right? One of the things that we find is that in most research on voters of the far right is that they're actually less politically active and less supportive of referendums. And so populism in particular is not revolutionary. They don't want a different system. They want different people. They believe that the elite is corrupt. So if you have good leaders, the problem is solved. I think there's space for democratic innovation, but I also think that most people are not particularly political. People already complain when they have to vote every 2 years. Like, the Dutch will go crazy that they have to vote again. Right? And so look at California. California has elections of everything. In the US, we elect judges, sheriffs, everything. Turnout in referendums is extremely low, which means that most of the time referendums are decided by a small hardcore minority that loses the elections. So what happens, elections are won by Democrats, referendums are often won by Republicans, which creates a system that's completely unworkable. So I'm not against it. I just think that many of the things that we propose come from a very specific group, which is already the most privileged group. And they benefit that group. And they are not necessarily the people who need it. Young men. So there is the perception that young men are more right-wing than whatever is, right? Young men are less right-wing than any other men. Young men are much more right-wing than young women. But that is because young women are much more left-wing than all other women. So the point is that the only movement that we see is women to the left, not men to the right. That being said, research shows that young men don't vote more for the far right than other men, but consider voting for the far right more than others. And that is a consequence of normalization. For young men, far-right parties are parties just like any other party. On top of that, young people in general are much less attached to so-called mainstream parties. In general, young people in general vote more for new parties. Young women disproportionately for the Greens, young men disproportionately in most countries for the far right. Are there things happening? Yes, there are things happening, but they're complex. one of the things that there's interesting research by someone like Gefjon Off, for example, about the concept of modern sexism. And modern sexism means that you believe that women are no longer discriminated, and that you are against any type of gender equality initiatives. But the interesting thing about that is that they don't necessarily oppose gender equality. They probably, in vast majority, support it. What they think is that it has been achieved, which means that any new policy that focuses on women, in their opinion, gives women an unfair advantage. And this is the consequence of simply the situation among young people in many countries, which is that young women outperform young men by significant distances in certain cases. At universities, in most countries, universities are female spaces. Right? I mean, we have positive discrimination of men at universities because universities are worried that the dating pool for the women is too small, right? And so this is a reality, right? Young men are underperforming in the US, but the US is a very specific case. Young men have a major problem, men in general, young men with suicide, drug addiction, other things. That being said, if you look, for example, at COVID, COVID had a horrible consequence for young women, particularly about body image, because people were very much online. So it's not that young men don't have problems, legitimate problems that should be addressed. It is that often young women have them too, but we don't care about those. So we now have a lot of debate about we need to find a progressive or a positive masculinity. I'm a father of 2 boys. I have no masculinity in my education. I don't raise my boys to be boys. I raise them to be humans. Why do we have a positive masculinity? Like, what is so important about masculinity that we have to, A, keep it, and B, reserve it for one part of humanity, right? And so I think we should get away from thinking in those categories. And again, it's not about ignoring their concerns. I mean, there are issues of loneliness, right? Actually, women are much more anxious. Men are much more lonely. There are issues of young men no longer know how to behave. Like, they have different demands on them. On the one hand, they have to be empathetic and open. On the other hand, they have to be masculine in certain ways. But let's face it, most women have that already for decades. They have to be feminine, motherly, but they also have to have a career. No one complained about that. No, well, they did, but no one cared about those complaints, right? So, I mean, I'm all for talking about young men if we also talk about young women, and if we don't only talk about that in terms of masculinity and femininity. Status, African Americans, Harris, we have to be very careful. I mean, almost all of what we pretend happened is based on very poor exit polls. It is true that there is a small group of African American men that don't vote for African American women. In my state, Georgia, we had Stacey Abrams, who ran for governor, same thing, possibly 10% of African American men. In close elections, relevant. In the larger story, completely irrelevant. Like 10% of African American men is, what, 1% of the population, if not less. There is significant support among Hispanics, for example, for the Republican Party. I think that has to do with COVID in part. Hispanics are pretty much more precarious economically. In the US, that means if you don't work, you don't eat, right? And so under COVID, under strong measures, if you were in regulated work, the state actually paid you very well. If you were in unregulated work, which most Hispanics are, you didn't get the subsidies, which means that any type of shutdown, which we had very few nevertheless, was very threatening for them. The other thing is that, weirdly enough, Trump had a very strong socioeconomic discourse towards Hispanics, even towards African Americans. The Democrats had only about discrimination, right? And your average Latin American person, like Hispanic or African American, is marginally existing socioeconomically. They care about poverty, they care about work, they care about those things. They want to hear, right? And so I think that was a major issue. I don't necessarily think that African Americans are still by far the strongest supporters of the Democratic Party. Like women, I think high in the 80s, if not 90s, but men still like high in the 70s. Jews, incidentally, who are also always mentioned as they've all gone to the Republican Party over Israel. Jews, American Jews, also by 2/3 or more vote for the Democratic Party. It's white people. White people are the problem. White men and white women. White women vote in majority for the far right. And so I think the other issue of Hispanics is interesting. Some research shows that the Hispanic people who vote for the Republicans are often third and fourth generation. But interestingly, they don't see themselves as Hispanic. They don't speak Spanish. The Democrats address them exclusively as Hispanic, whereas they feel included in the American of Trump, even though ICE will arrest them in a raid, right? But so immigrant is a very problematic term in general, right? But Hispanic is a very, very diverse category. Illiberal democracy is a very important point, and one that I'm very uncomfortable with. So Jan Werner Müller, who is a German colleague of mine who works at Princeton, who wrote an interesting book about populism, he's a very big critic of the term illiberal democracy.
He was a guest at the Renner-Institut last October, and I can fully support your point. Yeah, he's not a fan at all.
And he says, look, any democracy that is worth its name is, by definition, a liberal democracy. I think I agree. And I also very, very much agree on the importance of words. And we have to be very careful. That's why I don't like the term populism, because populism has become a euphemism for the far right. That being said, it helps me more to think about the Netherlands, to understand Hungary, than to think about China or North Korea. Hungary is still more the same like a liberal democracy than an authoritarian, let alone a totalitarian regime. And so we need a category in between a full liberal democracy and a full authoritarian regime. The fact is that the argument about illiberal democracy is that the undermining is in the liberalism, not in the democracy, right? And so that is why, that is what the term means. That being said, because liberal has become more and more seen in the American way, like as being left-wing, people like Orban embrace illiberalism now. But to be honest, you can't do anything about that. Like, I mean, the far right used to even embrace the term racism. And they would say, just look, if racism means that I stand up for my own people, I am a racist. If populism means that I care for the people, I'm a populist. Any term can be captured and recaptured, defined and redefined. But it is a problematic term. But if we don't have that category, I also think we miss a fundamental part of what these regimes are about.
I think there was one last question from you, no? which we missed. How to protect democracy, basically. Yeah.
Protect the institution. So we have the same in my country. Martin Bosma is the president of parliament, who is Geert Wilders' right man and a big supporter of apartheid, and et cetera, he intervenes when someone used the term extreme right, and when Wilders calls someone a parasite, he will just let it slide. It's very difficult. I find this very difficult because if we're going to exclude everything the far right is, says, and does, then they have absolutely no incentive to be part of our system, to play by our rules. I think it's fine, personally, if the far right, so if the far right is by rule becomes the president, or has the majority and becomes the president, we should accept that. If we elect the far right with support of liberal democratic parties, I think that is highly problematic. If there is a convention that the biggest party delivers the president, I think you can break that with the argument that we should have someone who actually cares for the institution and will protect it. If it is a rule, you should change the rule. If you don't change the rule, you have to respect the rule. But the fact that that person is the president doesn't mean that they can do whatever they want. And any action that goes against the institution or the spirit of the institution should be criticized at all times. Like loyalty is to the institution and the values underlying that institution, not to the person that holds it. But the reason why I don't think, those are often just, those are not the real issues. Right? The problem is not that they are the president. The problem is that there's so much support for this party that they get into the position that they could deliver the president. And that is what you need to address, right? And in the end, the far right is still predominantly supported because of dissatisfaction with what the other parties do. There is a small core that is far right, that wants a far right government. There is a larger group that is nativist, but that is not important to them, that mostly want certain things, preferably for white people, but as long as they get it, other people can get it too. You have to take care of those people. Right? The weird thing is we mostly are addressing the racists, the ones that actually believe. And we try to get them to come over. But they're never coming. Why would they? Right? It is the people who have been voting for social democratic parties or Christian democratic parties for decades, or would have voted for them, as long as we would talk about socio-economic issues, who vote now for the far right because we talk about social-cultural issues. Because one of the absolute important things is a book by Larry Bartels, who documents this. There is no right-wing shift in the population. The people today are even less right-wing than they were 2 decades ago, let alone 4 decades ago. People are less nativist, they're less sexist, they're less homophobic, they can deal with inclusion much more. All of these things. Not because people have changed, but because old people have died and young people have joined, and young people on average are more inclusive. On average, right? And so that is important because our narrative is very much, well, and that is particularly what the mainstream right and sometimes the mainstream left uses. Well, we don't like these policies, right? But this is democracy. The people want this. Now, it's true, the people overall are not big fans of immigration, particularly in Western, even more Eastern Europe. But that doesn't mean that they want the policies of the far right. More than anything, they want the idea that there is control. And that means that, A, you have to explain that there are no open borders. It's insane that this term is being used by serious people. that we have a choice between open borders and strict immigration policy. There's no country in the world with open borders, and Europe hasn't had an open border outside of within the EU for decades. In fact, we have draconian borders at the EU, right? We have to explain what the actual immigrant population is. Study after study shows that people who vote for the far right think that the percentage of immigrants and Muslims is by a factor of 5, if not more, higher than reality. And so if you think that over the last 20 years, the Muslim population of Austria went from 0 to 25, then it's totally rational that you think that Austria will be a Muslim country by 2050. If you know that it is, what, 2%, 3% probably, then people will think, okay, so maybe this isn't it. And so people are very poorly informed. And that's on many issues. Also socioeconomic inequality, for example. Like socioeconomic, if you ask people what socioeconomic equality, what it is today, right, it's completely out of range of what it really is. If you ask them what it should be, it's much less than it is today. And these are people who support like lower taxes and everything. So we often talk about people as if they're irrational. Many people, the vast majority of people, are not irrational. They are rational within the world that they think they live in. And so we're not dealing with irrationality, we're dealing with being uninformed. And that you have to change.
And I think these are beautiful closing remarks. Thank you, Cas, for your insights, for your expertise. Thank you, the audience, for your thoughtful questions. I always find the questions from the audience much more interesting than my own, at least much more surprising. The official part of the discussion ends now, but we invite you to some refreshments, and maybe you have the opportunity to raise some more questions. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you a pleasant night.